No, I was recording the audio version of my fantasy novel, Michelle Cottle.
This is
okay. I think we should
magic.
have a bonus episode about Ross's fantasy novel.
No,
Yes.
we can do a bonus. I will, in all seriousness, happily do a bonus episode about the fantasy novel.
Oh, happily. Of course you will. You're selling books. From New York Times Opinion, I'm Carlos Lozada.
I'm Michelle Cottle.
And I'm Ross Douthat.
And this is Matter of Opinion, where thoughts are allowed and clear. So, I learned something this week when I was reading the papers and watching the news, and that is that it turns out there are a lot of other elections happening in early November besides Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Were you guys aware?
I had heard something.
Kazakhstan has parliamentary elections? Is that what we're talking
What's your
about?
over-under there?
The Cambodian state legislatures? Yes, right?
I am not amused by your pretend ignorance. This is important.
So if you look back on our prior conversations, as I often do, this is what I do, I just listen to past Matters of Opinion. Is it Matters of Opinion or Matter of Opinions?
It's Matters of Opinion, clearly.
We have spent so much time talking about the presidential contest, about Trump and Harris and Vance and Walz. But of course, the success of the next president will depend in significant part on who controls the House and the Senate. So with just a few days left before this election on November 5th, I want your help. I want us to zoom in on what's happening in a few key House and Senate races, and also the races that we may be focused on ourselves as voters. And I hope we can work our way to thinking about how that future Congress, whatever it looks like, can shape the agenda and the power of the next president. So before we dive into specific races, let's just paint a quick picture of what's at stake broadly in the congressional election. So someone give me that 30,000-foot view here.
Okay, well, if you want to really make yourself panic, if you're not up for a Trump presidency, think about a Trump presidency where, as is often the case, almost always the case in modern politics, his party controls both chambers of Congress and has an unimpeded MAGA runway to just do whatever he wants. So just dig into that and ponder it for a minute, because it won't take
neutral.
much.
I think Carlos was asking for kind of like a neutral description, like how
Maybe
many
that's not
Senate
possible.
seats are
That's
up,
not possible
and
these days.
You're going straight to like dark MAGA apocalypse.
I mean, we can talk about the numbers.
Elon Musk is actually going to be elected to the Senate from 6 separate states. They've changed the rules. Just so
He's
you're
put
prepared.
enough money in.
There's going to be a Robovan in every pot.
All right. The one thing I know is that the entire House is up because it always is.
It always
right?
is. Yep.
And about a third of the Senate.
The House is up, and the Democrats need 4 seats to flip the House back to their control. And obviously, the Senate is, tighter than a hippo in Spanx. It is a bloody battle. The Republicans...
Is that a thing, or is that a caudalism?
I like to be visual. I like people to visualize how scary this is.
All right, a hippo in Spanx.
The Republicans are favored to take the Senate because of who's on the map and who's retiring. And so the big backstop to this would be if Democrats won back the House, and then you would have at least one chamber. I like divided government a lot of the time. People talk about how much they hate not being able to get stuff through. I tend to think with the nation this divided government is not a bad thing because it slows one party's agenda down. I know that is not a popular sentiment, but there you have it. So anyway, we're talking about Democrats needing to grab 4 seats to take back the House, or Republicans having to hold on by the skin of their teeth, and then the Republicans are favored to take back a basically evenly divided Senate.
Right, with the key races for those purposes being Montana, where right now it looks like John Tester, who has survived many past Senate campaigns, the populist Democrat farmer senator, he seems like he's in trouble. Ohio Democrats have been hoping that Sherrod Brown would hang on.
There's a toss-up in Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona.
Yeah, the Midwestern states are where, if the Republicans have a really good night, it will be because they were unexpectedly competitive in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I think everyone pretty much assumes that Kari Lake is going down to defeat in Arizona. That seems like less of a state to watch right now, though, of course, you never know. And finally, the Democrats have the great dream of unseating Ted Cruz in Texas.
Which is where I am this week.
All right.
I did some early voting with Ted. We did. We hit the community center. It was magic, not going to lie.
So basically, it looks like it's a coin toss. Coin toss is the metaphor of choice for a close election. Maybe there's some other one. But it's a coin toss in the House, and then the Republicans look perhaps more favorable in the Senate, especially with Joe Manchin leaving. You know, it's assumed West Virginia's a state that will go their way.
Well, I'm not even sure Democrats are really contesting.
Yeah, no. And so really, they just need to flip one Senate seat, or it can be split, and Vice President J.D. Vance can split all the differences.
Exactly.
Right. The reasonable thing to assume is that Republicans will have a razor-thin Senate majority when the night's voting is over.
Yeah, it could be more than the razor
If the
thin.
night goes well for them, they could wind up with more than that.
Yes.
Before I was in Texas, I was in Montana with Tester's folks, and it is a anxiety-inducing scene if you're a Democrat.
So, Michelle, let's go in that direction. I don't mean anxiety. I mean follow you in your travels.
Because Michelle has been doing real reporting.
Yeah, she is the one intrepid reporter here
on the trail.
on Matter of Opinion. So tell us, from where have you been filing expense reports?
Well, I did enjoy Bozeman. I had not been to Montana, and it is, as advertised, Yellowstone ready, fabulous.
Bozeman is like a colony of Los Angeles, though. At this point, it's kind of.
I was in Missoula. I was in Great Falls.
All right, that's legitimate.
Oh, that's not
Bozeman's
not real Montana.
No, 100.
Ross, I'm getting a Sarah Palin vibe here.
100. We drove. No, look. I know all about Montana because I drove through it in a minivan with my then.
I know about it because I drove through it.
Bozeman,
that's great.
Los Angeles. It's like rich people from California.
Which is exactly what you wrote about, Michelle, when you were looking at this Tester-She race. So tell us a little bit about not just the stakes, which we understand, control of the Senate, but, what are the issues that are coming to the fore in that race? One of which, of course, is, who is a real Montanan?
That is kind of what Tester in particular has made the centerpiece of his campaign, because the state, especially in the pandemic years, got this huge influx of out-of-staters moving there and kind of changing the culture, because a lot of these folks were very wealthy West Coasters moving in. So it's driven up costs, especially housing costs. And so you have this very interesting dynamic where what Republicans usually talk about is migrants coming in from poor foreign countries and changing the culture and dynamics and taking jobs and resources. You have something similar as a political theme in Montana, except it's the Democrat doing it. It's John Tester doing it, and his boogeyman is rich out-of-staters, which happen to include his Republican opponent, Tim Sheehy, who moved in like a decade ago and started a couple businesses. But what you have is Tester has long defied the political trends and survived as a Democrat in a very red state, because Montana went for Trump by 16 points.
So this would be his fourth term, right, Tester?
This would be his fourth term.
Okay.
The way he's done this is by pitching himself as Mr. Montana. He keeps a very, very big distance between himself and the national leadership of the Democratic Party. And he basically talks about he's a third-generation dirt farmer whose family's been there for a jillion years. And he still, he does ads on tractors and four-wheelers, which used to play really well in the state. But as the politics have gotten nationalized, even in Senate and House races, you tend to see more partisan tribalism. And with all of these newcomers coming into the state, there's some question about whether or not you've been there for 60 years or 100 years matters as much, because a huge number of Montanans now are transplants. And so you take all that and you mix it up, and it looks like Tester, the bill has come due. The demographics aren't the same, the political scene isn't the same, and he is the most vulnerable Senate member by far that everybody's looking at. And so much national money has gone into this race trying to tie him to the kind of very progressive wing of his party, they're talking a lot about trans rights, which is not a huge local drama in Montana, except that it's playing into the National Party messages.
Yeah, it's interesting, Michelle, right, the way that Tester has sustained himself as a Democrat with a fairly liberal voting record. Not the most liberal, but he hasn't been a Joe Manchin figure.
Yeah, he's not Joe Manchin.
He's been much more sort of affect, persona, tiller of the earth kind of shtick. He's missing fingers, right?
Three
Right.
fingers.
Yeah.
From that's a lunch meat accident.
But so he's sort of sold himself basically as the non-rich version of Kevin Costner in Yellowstone, our favorite show about Montana.
Has he sold himself as that, or is he that?
He's the non-rich, non-hot version. Does that count?
I think let's not. I think by the time you've been a U.S. Senator for 3 terms, you're no longer just a poor dirt farmer, no matter what you say. But that, I don't want to be cynical.
You're so
But
cynical.
yeah, I mean, fine. It's an interesting dynamic to be the liberal Democrat presenting yourself as the scourge of outsiders coming to take over Montana, because it's quite true that there's a lot of Republican money that has fled California for Idaho and Montana over the last 10 or 15 years. And the transformation of those states is itself just sort of a fascinating story in American life, accelerated clearly by the pandemic, COVID, and sort of people migrating. Yeah, but yes, I as someone who hasn't reported there, I agree that I think Tester is going to lose this time.
So, Michelle, Montana is one of several states with an abortion measure on the ballot as well this November. And you wrote about that when you were writing about this particular race. But you were saying that somehow the discussion of abortion rights politically was playing in kind of this nonpartisan sort of way. That was intriguing to me. How does it tell us about that?
So I've been looking at ballot measures since Kansas did the first one after Roe v. Wade was falling. One of the things that the people who organize these ballot measures stress to you is that you have to be very careful in red states not to pitch this as a partisan issue. So as much as the Democratic Party and its candidates really want these ballot measures to drive pro-choice voters to the polls, who are going to then maybe be the folks who are going to vote for Democratic candidates, it doesn't always work that way, especially in red states. The organizers do not mention party when they go door to door. So like if you were canvassing for this measure in Montana, you do not then go, Jon Tester is a pro-choice candidate, because in order to pass these things, you have to have non-Democratic voters. So they did this in Kansas. They've done similar things in other states that are redder than average. And so Tester is very much attaching himself to the abortion issue. But in order to get it on the ballot, they had to collect all these signatures. And it was like a historic number of people signed this measure to get it before voters. In order for that to have happened, it had to have been more than Democrats signing those petitions. So even if the abortion measure wins in Montana, Tester is still expected to go down. On the other hand, if he does somehow pull it out, people on the Democratic side are like, it will be in part because of this measure driving more Democrats to the polls.
Yeah, I mean, I've wondered throughout the referenda process just how much does this actually help Democrats win elections?
Only on the margins is what they say.
And fundraising, probably.
Oh, yes.
But if you're Tester, Montana is a right-leaning state, but it's one of the most libertarian right-leaning states. A perfect place, I would assume, as Republican-leaning states go to run a pro-choice ballot measure. But precisely because of that, it's harder for Tester to say, here, vote for me because you need me in Washington to make sure that abortion stays legal in Montana, if Montana's voters are being told, guess what? All you have to do to keep abortion legal in Montana is vote in this ballot initiative. It seems totally plausible that that's a difficulty for Democrats, right?
Yeah.
That they're trying to make a national case, but meanwhile, if they're winning the state ballot measures, the urgency of that national case for pro-choice voters is just going to feel a lot weaker.
And for people for whom this is the primary issue, they're not willing to risk having the measure fail on the off chance that they could help Tester. So I talked to, this fantastic 70-year-old lifelong conservative Republican who is so ticked off about her party's position on abortion that she is like a super volunteer for this ballot measure. She is out there ringing doorbells, gathering signatures, but she will not even talk about party. She refuses to even say who she's voting for this year because she just wants it to be so outside the realm of party fights.
So let's temporarily leave big sky country.
Oh.
Ross, is there a particular race anywhere in the country that you are just fixated on?
I do think that one of the most interesting ones is the race we haven't mentioned yet, which is the Nebraska Senate race.
Oh, yes.
Where in lieu of having a competitive Democrat, there is an independent candidate, Dan Osborne, who is in certain ways like Tester, but more so an extremely sort of blue-collar populist figure, but also running a slightly more, I would say, Manchin-like campaign in terms of presenting himself as a real moderate on the issues, not someone who's just going to be a down-the-line vote for liberal priorities. And he's running a surprisingly competitive campaign against the Republican incumbent Senator Deb Fischer, who is a sort of, undistinguished, not particularly notable Republican senator in a reliably Republican state. I don't think Osborne is likely to win. I think what often happens with these kind of candidates is they sort of fly under the radar for a while. Nobody notices them. Nobody attacks them very much. They get surprisingly strong polling results, and then they get associated with national politics and they fall short. That's my expectation here. But it is a very interesting model for essentially what you could call not even Democrats, non-Republicans in red states.
And the independent has said he wouldn't caucus with either party, which is very unusual. That does not happen. I don't think that would hold, but it's a fascinating promise.
Well, I think it would have to hold if he won and wanted to win re-election. I think if you had a guy who won as an independent in Nebraska and started caucusing with the Democrats, he might as well just throw his re-election bid
maybe
away.
It is hard to not caucus with those parties. Like, you don't get any perks.
Well, right. Well, that's the trade-off. But the reality is in those states, the national Democratic brand is so bad, so toxic. But there are also still voters who don't like the Republican Party, right, and are sort of open to an alternative. And, this is where people had kicked around the idea of Joe Manchin plus Mitt Romney, third party just for the Senate alliance. Obviously, nothing came of that. But, it's an interesting model to try and run as a genuine independent, not just as a sort of Democrat light. And it has parallels to the efforts of moderate Republicans to win in deep blue states, like your home state of Maryland, Carlos, where, an interesting question. Larry Hogan, right, the incredibly popular Republican governor of Maryland, is running.
Yeah.
Have you been watching this, Carlos, a ton? Because I did some reporting with both those candidates, and I want to hear your take.
Yeah. So I live in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., and this Senate race, I think, speaks to a similar idea that you encountered in Montana, Michelle, about the national overpowering the local. So we have former two-term governor Larry Hogan, a Republican, running against Angela Alsobrooks, a Democrat. She's the county executive here and former state's attorney in Prince George's County. Hogan was a very popular two-term governor here. People in Maryland liked that he was this kind of independent-minded Republican who would speak out against Trump when he felt it was necessary. A nice bit of trivia, of course, is that his father, Lawrence Hogan, was a member of Congress from Maryland and the only Republican in the House Judiciary Committee to vote for all 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. So there's some family history there about kind of bucking your own party. Now, he's the kind of Republican who can win in a blue state like Maryland. But of course, putting Hogan in the Senate would help give Republicans a majority. So there's this sort of reluctance, not really reluctance about Alsobrooks, who has a healthy lead in the polls.
Well, she's going to win.
Of course she's going to win, because Maryland's like the bluest state in the freaking country.
Which had a two-term Republican governor from 2014 to 2022.
And they still love him. Like, I talk to voters who are like, I love him, but I can't vote for him for Senate.
Yeah, no, that's the story. You literally see the ads. The ads are like, I voted for Larry Hogan twice. Larry Hogan was a good governor, but he can't be in the Senate.
Her bus tour is named either, I can't remember, is it protecting or defending our majority? It has nothing to do with what she wants to do or who she is.
For me, Larry Hogan's the kind of Republican I want in the Senate. I want more Republicans like Larry Hogan to exist. But a lot of the case has been about the dangers, not of Larry Hogan himself, but about Republicans controlling the Senate. So that's what makes this sort of a very interesting race.
But you're, as a Maryland voter, Carlos, since, as we've just said, there's a very good chance Republicans will control the Senate no matter what. Isn't it in then your interests as a conflicted centrist to have some voices in the Republican Senate caucus meetings? I don't know, maybe you're cagey, maybe you're a communist. Who can say?
That's Hogan's pitch, Ross.
That's Hogan's pitch, right? So I'm saying, I think for the coveted Carlos vote, you should think about that. Don't you want him in the room where it happens? If there's a Republican
I just said
Senate
he's the
majority?
Kind of Republican I want in the Senate.
Exactly. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
If you listen to him on the trail, that's exactly what he says. He's like, how much better will it be with me in the room?
I do think, though, that this issue about caucusing with a party, like to get whether it's sort of non-Republicans in deep red states or non-Democrats in deep blue states, you would need some vehicle for people to operate in the Senate without just caucusing with one party or the other. And I think, Hogan, probably he would lose some Trumpy Republican votes if he said he wouldn't caucus with the GOP. But at some point, if you wanted more of those figures, you would need some way for people to credibly say, look, if you elect me, I'm not giving the Republicans or the Democrats the majority. I'm not that 50th or 51st vote. You can vote for me just as myself. That doesn't happen at the moment for good reasons, but that would be what you would need, I think.
You'd have to take down the team pressure, which is what the Senate runs on. It's not just about the individual. It is a team game. And you'd have to find a way to take that away.
And as you said, you don't get any power and influence.
You don't get committee preference.
All you have is a vote. And that's where if you had 4 people, then you could say, look, you have to give us something because we're the swing block, right? You need some version
team.
of that.
We're
We're our own team.
Dang it.
Anyway, not going to happen, but an interesting scenario.
All right, well, let us take a quick break here. When we come back, let's get into how much all these down-ballot races can and will change the national outlook depending on who wins the White House. So stay with us. And we're back. After our down-ballot discussion, it seems like it is more likely that Republicans can retain control of the legislative branch. So, Michelle, what is it that they want to do with it?
Well, unsurprisingly, they feel like they wasted the last time they had unified control for a couple of years. And so,
Infrastructure Week.
It's Infrastructure Week. Steve Scalise, the current majority leader, has been talking to reporters, and he has said that that's not going to happen again. So they're getting their ducks in a row, and one of the things that he is really hot for is, this being the Republican Party, cutting some taxes. He wants to cut that corporate tax rate. Trump has basically spent the last few weeks of this campaign promising to cut taxes on damn near everybody. We may be the last people he's not cutting taxes on, but he wants...
No tax on fill in the blank.
He wants no tax on tips. He wants, overtime taxes cut, car loan taxes cut, Social Security taxes cut. And this suits a Republican House just fine. Probably the way to make up any kind of revenue shortage will be just to drill, baby, drill, pass a lot of policies that would, get them more oil and gas money, repeal the electric vehicle tax credit. Now, of course, Trump being Trump, he's going to do what he wants to do, and we'll just see what he wants to focus on. Maybe he'll be rounding up immigrants first or whatever. We'll just have to wait. But the tax piece of it has the House Republican Conference. Their mouth is watering.
I mean, you mentioned the corporate tax, right? I mean, I think there's a big question, maybe more of a question than usual, about what a Republican tax cut would actually look like. Because first, the original Trump tax cuts are scheduled to expire in 2025. So there are Republicans, I think, who will be sort of eager to basically just vote to extend the Trump tax cuts and declare that is their great tax-cutting victory, which means they don't even have to get into worrying about deficit issues and so on. They just declare themselves tax cutters by keeping the baseline.
But that's not what Trump has promised. So it depends.
Well, Trump has promised, okay, right. So then Trump has promised everything.
Everything.
If he's elected, he'll have, the corporate tax cut, the further corporate tax cut faction. He'll have the J.D. Vance faction that wants to do a big family-friendly tax cut. And then he has his grab bag of,
the SALT tax
tips,
cap, that sort of thing.
That's right. He's promised.
They pushed that through last time he was president, but now he's like, oh, just kidding. Let's take that back.
Right. But that's one that all the Republican tax wonks, such as they are, will rebel against. That's one of their proudest achievements.
That's true. But then the moderates in those suburban districts are going to have, their little hissy fit.
Right. I'm just saying that I think there's an easy Republican tax scenario, which is just sticking with the original Trump tax cuts and adding something around the margins. But then if you're trying to do something beyond that, you're going to get into a really interesting battle royale of different GOP factions, corporate tax cuts, family tax cuts, SALT, taxes on tips, you name it. And I don't honestly have any idea how that fight turns out.
Well, it depends on how big the margins are, right? Like, if the Republicans do not maintain control of the House, this is a moot point.
Right.
There's so many X factors, so many variables that you can't say kind of exactly what will happen. You just know what they want to do and what they're hoping to do and what they're going ahead and planning for in case, because they want to be ready. They do not want to waste their opportunity.
So the implication of this conversation so far is Republican control of the House and Senate and Trump in the White House. How does this happen if Kamala Harris wins the White House?
I mean, I think, I'm curious what Michelle thinks. I think if Harris wins the White House and Republicans hold Congress, I mean, we're talking about the smallest of all small ball policy, except that there will be, again, a big knockdown, drag out scrap about the Trump tax cuts. And this is sort of the issue that neither campaign really wants to talk about that much. But if it's Harris in the White House, she's going to be negotiating with Republicans in the Senate over what that tax cut extension looks like. And that's basically going to be the whole fiscal argument, probably, for the first couple of years.
Well, if Harris winds up winning the White House, the odds are that the Democrats wind up taking the House. So you still have divided government, but it looks more manageable in terms of, at least getting her agenda discussed. I mean, if Republicans have both chambers of Congress and she's in the White House, you're never even going to have her policies taken up for serious discussion. It's just not going to happen.
Right. I mean, we should also entertain a scenario where big surprises happen. Maybe the independent wins in Nebraska, Brown holds on in Ohio, the polls are wrong, and Ted Cruz goes down in Texas, right? And Democrats have let's say it's a 50-50 Senate. I think most people assume, maybe wrongly, but assume that if Republicans are in charge, even though Donald Trump will tell them that he wants to get rid of the filibuster, they will not get rid of the filibuster. That nobody wants to get rid of the filibuster on a 51-49 vote. What getting rid of the filibuster does is it exposes swing state politicians to votes they don't want to take. The Democrats, though, have pushed a lot of chips onto the table in the idea of getting rid of the filibuster. And Harris herself has said we could get rid of the filibuster to pass, national abortion legislation. So that, I think, again, in the, unlikely world where Democrats have a 50-50 Senate with Vice President Walz casting the deciding vote, there's going to be a lot of frenzy on the left and center left about what happens to the filibuster.
True, but they don't even need those if you're talking about tax cuts or anything that has to do with the strict budget. The Democrats can do that on a straight majority.
Yes, but abortion, voting rights, there's a long list of things that part of the party would like to do.
And both Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are gone.
Right.
And they were the two who were holding up the train on the Democratic side, much to Democrats' fury. And so the question is, what does it look like?
Or to the secret satisfaction of Democratic senators who also didn't want to get rid of the filibuster, but didn't want to say so.
Now you're just playing four-dimensional chess, Ross. It's so strategic.
So I have a question here that sort of comes out of all this. Whose agenda, Trump or Harris, is more dependent on control of Congress? Like, you need Congress for tax cuts, but not for, like, tariffs. When Harris talks about the stuff she wants to do, she always ends like, send me the bill to codify Roe v. Wade and I'll proudly sign it into law, right? Like, send me that border security bill and I'll proudly sign it into law. If you have divided government, is it just going to be a lot of emphasis on executive orders and a lot of rhetoric around bills that will never become law?
I think for both of them, Trump more so because it's his signature issue, but for both of them, immigration is going to be the issue where there'll just be a lot of executive action or inaction, right? Mm-hmm. And basically a lot of debate and a lot of court cases about the limits of executive authority around immigration. I mean, I think Trump, in his first term, he didn't really work that hard to pass sweeping immigration legislation. He just did most of the stuff using executive power. Maybe that's different if they get a big Senate majority, but I think the action on immigration may be somewhat independent of partisan control. Everything else, we're not talking about foreign policy, but everything else domestically, who controls the Senate matters a great deal.
And there's the question of Trump shut down the government because Congress wouldn't fund the border wall. So there is a question of the money for his priorities. So that matters as to whether or not he has enough support in Congress to just do what he wants to do financially. But foreign policy is something that we're not talking about, but that's where the president tends to make me very nervous because the president has a lot of leeway, much more even than domestic policy, and can cause a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and that's where over the decades, more and more power has been ceded to the executive.
Yeah, because Congress doesn't want the responsibility. I mean, they can pretend they do, but they like to pass off those really kind of sticky issues.
So I have no doubt that we will be back discussing not just the results of the congressional races, but then what Congress actually attempts to do.
It's so exciting.
Until then, we'll take a break here. When we come back, hot cold. All right, guys, who's got a hot or a cold this week?
I have a warm, somewhat hot. It's not
overwhelming.
It's not called hot, warm, cold. It's hot, cold.
It's hot. No,
it's tepid.
It's hot. No, we've been watching in our house the show Tokyo Vice, which has been out for a couple of seasons. It's not a brand new show, but it is based on a memoir of sorts by an American who becomes the first non-Japanese reporter at a leading Tokyo daily and gets enmeshed in the Tokyo underworld and tangles with the Yakuza and all the rest.
Are you thinking of doing this, Ross? Is this like
I have been thinking,
yes,
this is a career move. And it's interesting. It's sort of similar to Shogun, which was the big hit of this year. It's a similar sort of, white guy in Japan kind of story, except instead
several
of
hundred years in the future from Shogun.
But like instead of samurai warlords, it's Yakuza warlords. Like there really is sort of an interesting parallel between the shows. And one thing that I particularly like is it stars Ansel Elgort. I'm never sure how to pronounce his name, but he is possibly my least favorite movie star. He was in Baby Driver, The Fault in Our Stars,
yeah.
the Spielberg West Side Story. I find him absolutely insufferable. He just exudes smug.
Why are you happy that it stars him?
Because he's perfect for this part. He's playing a kind of arrogant young American who, is sort of, has an alienated, complex relationship with his family back in Missouri, thinks he's so cool because he's escaped into Japan, and then sort of keeps getting bloodied and beaten up by the culture that he just does not fully understand.
Oh my God, you just want to see him beaten.
So I wanted to see, did I want to see Ansel Elgort, suffer a little at the hands of the Yakuza?
Right.
Maybe I did. Maybe I did.
So, Ross, does Tokyo Vice bear any resemblance to Miami Vice? Because I loved Miami Vice.
So
is there a sports car and no socks?
being younger than both of you by many, many years.
Oh, years.
The Miami Vice that, means the most to me is the Michael Mann movie, not the 80s TV show.
No,
yes.
We can't let him talk about culture.
Yes. So I'm not going to give you strong views. I will say our son, our 8-year-old, is sort of obsessed with Japan, East Asia generally, but Japan specifically. And I sort of feel bad this is not a show that he can watch, right? But watching this show because, if I even mention it to him, he really wants to go to Tokyo. And there's no way I'm getting 5 kids to Tokyo in the foreseeable future. But I do feel like I'm letting him down.
It's a parenting
So if
fail,
any
Ross.
listeners will have like a good program in Tokyo that I
For
can send an
8-year-olds?
8-year-old to, please leave us a voicemail. I'd appreciate it.
All right. Let's reconvene next week, which will be the final episode of Matter of Opinion before the election.
So much anxiety.
Dun, dun, dun.
The suspense is killing me.
See you then.
See you guys.
Bye, guys.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Matter of Opinion is produced by the wonderful Sophia Alvarez-Boyd, Andrea Betanzos, and Phoebe Lett. It's edited by the ever-patient Jordana Hoogman. Our ace fact-checking team is Kate Sinclair, Mary Marge Locker, and Michelle Harris. Original music by Isaac Jones, Efim Shapiro, Carol Saburo, Sonia Herrero, Amin Sahota, and Pat McCusker. Mixing by Carol Saburo. Audience strategy by Shannon Busta and Christina Samuelewski. Our executive producer, the Princess Leia of this Rebel Alliance, is Annie Rose Strasser.